pops up at the top. It's just reminding you that we're recording this. If you don't like seeing it, just hit the dismiss button. It will go away. All right. And thanks everyone for being here tonight. And we're going to have a great evening.
Thank you, Kirsten. So I think first we'll start with just some brief introductions of your two instructors this evening. Robin Friedman, who you see on the screen right now. Robin, why don't you introduce yourself real quickly?
Sure. So I'm Robin Friedman. I'm the Regional Disaster Officer for the California Gold Country region for about the last 6 years. How much am I supposed to say, Al? Much or a little or a lot at this point?
Well, you might have to say that you had the privilege of closing a DR or
Sure.
2 or 3. That might help, you know, because that's what we're talking about.
Yeah, so quite often Al and I swap jobs as boss or sub-boss or AD of something, and over the last 7 years, I've mostly been the guy that's received the end of a DR. As a regional disaster officer, you know, I'm really most interested in how this stuff comes to me from a regional perspective. I start a lot of them, but I don't really do a lot of the closing stuff. So there's some great learning points from this. And Al and I often swap positions, and I've worked with many of you in the activity of closing out DRs, and more importantly, receiving them.
Yeah, I'm honored and privileged to work again with Robin. Yes, as Robin mentioned, he and I have worked together, switching roles, you know, whether ops AD or job director or deputy director, or I don't know, catch whatever needs to be done kind of role. But Denise Everhart is who I am her volunteer partner. I've been a volunteer with the Red Cross now going on 16 years. And she's sort of pushed me in that cubbyhole of closing DRs. And I enjoy the role, to tell you the truth. And tonight, that's what we're going to talk about. And I think closing, the best way to really initiate it is talking about the fact that it is probably for the most challenging part of a DR, because you are changing the reactionary thinking. And we're going to talk a bit about the phases in a DR. But, you know, the challenging part is, I think, and I hate to say this to this group that's all learned and experienced out there, is that I think it's a very, very good guess at what you're going to do in closing and how you're going to close. And it takes the data-driven decisions. It takes good teamwork in the planning from all of the ADs, as well as their subordinates, to come up with what's happening out there to really give you a good, solid picture of the situation that's happening today and what's anticipated in the days to come as you try to wind down this DR. So with that, Robin, you want to put the slide up? That would be really good.
Okay, should be up, Al.
I'm looking at a big yellow circle. There we go. Everybody see that? I hope you do. So I ask you, and some of the ground rules, I guess, is if you've got a question or something like that. We have Eddie Gilbert on the line. He's going to watch the chat room. So if you got questions, etc. But, you know, Robin and I don't mind if you interrupt us, if you've got something really pertinent to say to add to the group, or something I said isn't correct. That's a possibility too. You can always interrupt me and correct me. Okay, so moving right in here. So tonight we're talking, as we said, going to talk about closing a DR. And I want to talk first about understanding the operational phases of a DR. And those 4 in front of you on the screen right now, which are initial, the stabilize, sustain, and then demobilization. And demobilization gets us to the closing, the official closing of a DR. Next slide, please. So in that first phase, we want to talk about the initialization phase. But there's a couple words in the slide deck. I made the slide deck and Robin made it pretty, but there's a couple words in here, quite honestly, I wanted to remove because I have a tough time pronouncing them, but we'll see. One of them is initialization. This begins when an incident or disaster occurs or is expected to occur. This is when we can ramp up. We can, in pre-notice events, we can pre-stage some items, pre-stage both the material and human resources, et cetera, and we get those things in place. The no-notice event, that's when we're sprinting, much like some of the Northern California fires. We saw that we had to evacuate one of our Red Cross offices in the middle of the night and move things. That's part of all the initialization phase. Okay, this phase is marked by rapid scaling up to meet the projected needs. And the two words I use a lot in anything in DR is that we're always assessing the needs of our staff, the needs of our clients, the needs of the community, the needs of responding and reacting to this incident. The other side of it is resources. What are the resources that are going to meet these needs? What are the and how often, how long, and how much do we need of these resources? All of those are in reactive mode within the initial phase. Next slide. The following phase is the stabilization phase. This begins when the DRO has sufficient human and material resources. Does it ever really have enough of that? Probably not, because in the initialization, we're trying to figure out how big, how large. We talk about speed to market, speed to scale, things like that. But we're trying to adjust to what we're seeing out in the field. Is it enough? Is it fast enough? Do we have enough to maintain that? So the stabilization phase is sort of just another step after the initialization. We fill the market, so to speak, with as much human resource and material resources we have at hand, and try to, in the stabilization, to make sure that we have sufficient. Okay, and then next slide, in the sustain phase is when we hopefully have the right people, the right leadership in place, et cetera. Okay, and sustain generally begins when the operations capacity for most of the essential service delivery has declined 20% or less of the stabilization phase. Is that set in stone? Not really. It isn't. It is. Have we realized we have enough? We talk about when we look at an RC view and we look at rates of things we've either spent or initiated or brought on board or resourced, and we watch that and watch the burn rate. How quickly are we using it? How quickly is it being replenished? Those sort of things keep us in mind as to, is it ramping up? Is it still increasing? Are we still opening more shelters? Are we still looking for the next warehouse? Are we looking for more vehicles or more trucks or whatever? Then we're still in that stabilization. There's that word, stabilization phase, to see that it's at the right level. So sustaining says we've leveled off here somewhere. We've gone a little beyond what we truly need, and that's where the ending or closing a DR, the conversation begins. It truly is beginning to understand the situation out in the field. Have we reached our peak? And understanding why we've reached our peak. Okay, we look at the numbers. The shelter population is leveling off. It was 170 the night before, and now it's 160, and it goes down a couple more days, et cetera. Do we expect it? And that's the information we need from the field, is do we expect to see more? Is something else happening? As we see here in Northern California, wildfires. Wildfires are very challenging because they're ever changing. We can think we are in a stabilization phase, but all of a sudden the wildfire jumps the lines. It increases. We have another evacuation notice. We're right back into initiating another phase of the DR. So it is always looking at the needs and the resources of that particular moment in time. So if we get to that sustainment phase and we are downturning, then that's when we're going to start talking about, okay, what can we close? What can we diminish? What can we have less of? And those are hard conversations, because it's, in a lot of ways, when you initiate a response like a big DAT call, is throw as many resources as you got at it, right, and see if it's enough. Do you have the right people, the right trained and experienced people to do the job? And so those the first phases are and I hate to downplay them, but they are really a natural instinct for us Red Crossers. We know that we need to get X amount of resources to do X amount of work or in fulfilling our mission. But if we don't have those resources, then we scramble to find where those resources are, et cetera. For those of you who have been on a island response, as an example, you have to have that forethinking even more so, because if it's not on that island, it's going to take that much longer and that much more time to get it to where you need it to be. So those pieces, that phase from stabilization to sustain, are critical in the success of a good DR. So from sustainment, go to the next slide, please. So again, here, the demobilization, and we call it demob, begins when the end of all service delivery has been scheduled. Okay, and it says all in the book, but it's not really all. You're demobilizing because you might be in consolidation. Okay, you might be closing one shelter and moving the existing population staff into another shelter. You may be consolidating your staff shelters. You may be consolidating your work fleet. Because you don't need that many trucks. You are winding down DES, those sort of things. That is all part of demobilization, but again, you're always looking at the needs and the resources of that moment in time in the disaster. So Robin, I'll pick on you for a second. That's something you as an RDO really have to do on a regular basis, whether it's a multifamily fire or it's the wildfire that's burning half the state down. You always have to look at the resources you have at hand. Maybe you can give us a little key is what says you have enough to you, or what means, what tells you you have to have more?
Well, a big part of it, of course, is the development of the service delivery plan, and that thoughtful process that occurs in conjunction with your divisional partners, the national partners that help you have that logical discussion about setting goals, objectives, and timelines for what it is that you're trying to do. In particular, I think most RDOs and most disaster program managers at a local level have a pretty good feeling of the types and the numbers of resources that are particularly of a critical nature. Things such as cots and blankets, in teams of stuff, and herbs and local contracts that you have in relationship. And most of us sort of have those in a little tool bag that we keep beside our desk or bring back and forth with us home, either in our head or on our cell phone or in a variety of different locations. And I think most of us probably play through the scenarios all the time about what those resources really are. But what happens is we kind of get used to certain sizes of disaster responses also. You know, we know that over the course of a fire season, we're going to have fires that are going to be, 50 people in a shelter. And we kind of know what those resources are that are necessary to do it. They tend to be in the same area. It tends to be the same set of shelters. What's really important is that discussion with our partners at the division and national level about setting the appropriate goals and figuring out what the appropriate resources that are necessary to build the team. And then the challenge is, at the end of the whole process, ensuring we have those resources restocked and repacked and put back into place so that we can address the next one or the concurrent one, which is not at all unusual in our division.
Absolutely. Well said, Robin. Thank you. Then the other piece that's in demobilization, as you see on the slide, the recurring need for resourcing has ended, or you expect it to end. So you're not necessarily replenishing, or you're diminishing the number of meals you need to be delivered. Those sort of things are in play. So that would be part of the demobilization. Demobilization ends when the operational responsibility has transitioned back to the affected region or regions or area. Okay, so that would be really the closing, the official closing, and we'll talk about that in a little bit. It goes back to the region. So next slide, please. And any questions on the DRO operational phases? Either raise your hand or go to the chat. And while I'm waiting for that, hi, Dave Frommer. Good to see you on.
Nothing in the chat.
Okay, we're moving along. So no questions. Either I put them all asleep or we're just buzzing along. That's cool. So let's talk now about some demobilization points. You know, a couple of things that are earmarks, so to speak. So keeping in mind the districts are temporary, if you have districts in this DRO, and you plan to scale down, consolidate, and demobilize the district operations, okay? But you have to keep in mind there that if there is any kind of service delivery continuing that needs to continue after you close the district, can headquarters or another district take on that service delivery? So that is really key. You can't just say, okay, district, thank you very much for a job well done. Let's shut it down and everybody go back to whatever you're doing kind of thing, or pull them back into headquarters. But you need to have the plans in place, the operational plans in place to take on what's left if they're going to, in fact, demobilize a district. So always you're in alignment with the service delivery plan to figure out when a district will complete its direct services. That is a discussion that's in the planning meeting every single day. Okay, and I know that I've heard many outside folks from outside of Red Cross or government agencies says it looks like Red Cross always wants to close their shelters. Well, you know what, folks? Closing a shelter means we're successful because of our criteria to close down a shelter. That means we've taken care of our clients. They have a place to go, or we're putting them in another shelter kind of thing. But that means we're succeeding in fulfilling our mission if we're able to close things down. So that's all in the planning communication cycle that needs to take place. So you could be consolidating your shelters. The service delivery of some sort continues, and you're still in demobilizing at that point there. So one of the big ones that I've seen in several large is the IRFs. The DRO remained nameless, but one place where we had, I don't know, 212 IRFs arrive, and suddenly we had to, and most of those were broken by the time they got to us. And in the demobilization plan, we had to find ways of servicing all of those IRFs so they could be sent home, be roadworthy. They had to be inspected properly, et cetera. That's a heavy load on logistics to take care of those sort of things. Again, that's in the planning discussion phase when you're in demobilization. To see, that takes time. It takes a lot of time to be able to do that. Now, okay, next slide, please. So then I'm going to throw a term at you called retrograde. And retrograde means we're doing other services other than putting it out in the field. That means we're taking care of stuff. Okay, that means like I just mentioned, the IRFs need to be serviced and inspected and be made roadworthy. So, but it involves a lot of movement of stuff. But again, that's part of closing down because it is not primarily meant for direct service to our clients and the communities at large. It is really taking care of our stuff and our people, et cetera. Okay, but it is when you have a disaster that is large scale, et cetera, you have to look at your operations and start thinking about what you don't need and what you need to do with those things you don't need anymore. I'm putting it in simple terms. So those you need to be able to restore stuff. My mantra when I go on a DR is always to, when I leave, I left it in a better position than it was when I arrived. And that's the relationships, that's everything across the board as far as the stuff and the people. They've learned something, they've gained an experience, they've gotten trained, we've restocked everything properly, et cetera, et cetera. So retrograde operations are it's at first a heavy burden on closing a DR because now you're sort of doubling up what you're doing. You're still doing service delivery out to the communities, but now you're taking equipment offline, but you have to be able to make that equipment and the people and the stuff usable for the next time. So that's is something to really be thinking about. So you want to ensure the well-being and the readiness of the Red Cross disaster workforce throughout all of this. I mean, when people are shifting gears and, for most part, all of us, none of us like change. We don't. We challenge change. Why are we changing? And all that good stuff. We had a couple good courses that were talking about getting to why. And another one that talked about crisis leadership, and both of those offered talking about thinking about the willingness and the readiness of the Red Cross disaster workforce, and that's critical. And when you're making changes about disaster response to disaster recovery to disaster steady state. No, next slide, please. So as you see on the slide here, it talks about the well-being and readiness of the workforce, but situational awareness. So I think we beat this term up. And just understand what's truly going on out there. Numbers alone don't tell you the story. Numbers alone will not be the deciding factor for you. Yes, we use the term of data-driven decisions, but those data-driven decisions are really about the people, places, and things that you have out in that arena. How are they being affected? How are they being received? Are they ready for us to leave, kind of thing? Can they carry on, so to speak? So those pieces of data-driven management decisions have to have other pieces attached to them. So, in part of the retrograde operations, you're returning the previously deployed resources and systems. The DFSC shelter trailers as a fine example. They have to be restuffed, repacked, and sent back. So the logs again is taking on a heavy burden about having the resources to resource those sources that they used. So there's a lot of good things going on there. So this is really important at this stage here. And Eddie Gilbert does a dynamite job on this phase. Well, he does a dynamite job on the whole thing, but particularly in this the tracking and updating the progress of what's going on with restocking and restuffing and shipping to return the goods and services in the shelter items. That's incredible. I know that in a couple wildfires when we had, I forget which fire it is, but Robin, you were involved in that when we built, I don't know, 5,000 or 6,000 wildfire kits. And the great war that went on about how are we going to count these and where are they going to go, the ones we didn't use, and who is going to own them and what was the cost. And I think we spent probably 2 weeks having conversations about that. But all of that, if you think about it, all fit in a retrograde operation because we are done with putting out wildfire kits out into the field. But now we had to figure out the overall cost and agree upon that. And that was a conversation in itself with National. I give you a little insight on that one because I forget how many items were in the wildfire kits. 17 to 18.
17 items. Yeah.
17 items. And at first we were told that we would count these as 17 items. And we were saying, okay, that's a gazillion. We have a gazillion pieces now. Why can't we just count these as one wildfire kit, the 17? So we went back and forth on how that was going to affect the budget in terms of cost, et cetera. And we were saying the cost is the same, but those are conversations that take place in the background in affecting the retrograde operation that you're trying to get to demobilization. So anything up on the chat room there, Eddie?
We're just going back and forth on demob and retro and when that everybody's trying to find a definitive answer, a drop dead thing, and it's really not that.
Yeah, there truly isn't a drop dead. It's it's a both or none or one or either, all at the same time. Robin?
Yeah, so Al, I think this is important. If anybody needs some sifters, I've got several thousand of them that are available to anybody. So the planning process for retrograde operations inevitably ends up in two different people's hands, maybe three different groups of hands. One is it going back to the DSFCs, again, packed up and neatly shipped back. The other ends up staying in local regions, and that negotiation and discussion with the job director and the RDO is really an important conversation. I think you're going to talk about that a little bit more later on. The third major component, though, is all the donated and in-kind stuff and how you move that stuff on, especially in larger DRs. You end up with piles and piles and piles of stuff that has value to somebody, but not necessarily to you as a region. You know, I really don't need dancing shoes in the California Gold Country region to respond to the circumstances. And you often end up with more stuff than you have storage capacity, or there's a cost to storing things. So having these conversations in the movements early in both in the demobilization process, and sometimes the stuff doesn't have a place to retrograde to, and that acquires cost and effort for your team.
Yeah, well said, Robin. Well said. So the next slide, please. The scaling down and closing. So we're going to talk about that. What did you just do? Oh, there we are. I got out of turn here. So there's one of those words I thought, Robin, I thought about taking it out, is diminution. That word just did not want to come out of my mouth. Okay, but so I'm going to just say less than. So we're going to lower it. So it is bringing down the services and the support that we have. You're starting to scale those things down, and the hard part there is how much and when do you do this? That's the big guess. And again, you look at your data, you talk to your ADs, you talk to their folks, and get a true picture of what is going on, what is expected, and what's anticipated down the road, if and when we start downturning some things. So we always have to keep in mind about accomplishing the goals and the mission of the operation. It has to keep in our forefront of our mind as to what are those two words I talked about earlier was needs and resources. What are the needs of the community, those that are affected? If we can get a good grasp of what those needs are, a lot of times that's camouflaged. A lot of times we think that sheltering and feeding is the ball game kind of thing that will accomplish those sort of things. But there's much more to be considered at that moment and down the road, et cetera. So identify the remaining service delivery by other units. The other units meaning outside sources, inside sources, all the units that you have within your DRO. What are those remaining service delivery that we have? As I mentioned, if you're thinking about consolidating or closing a district, the service delivery there may still have to continue in a lesser number, but how is that going to be accomplished? Is headquarters going to take that on? Or is another district going to be able to take that on, or another unit be able to take that on, depending upon, again, what the need and what the resource is, who has the wherewithal to do that. So and transfer those remaining units, the districts, the shelters, et cetera. Okay, we're going to consolidate them, and then we're going to transfer them to whoever needs to take them on. In a lot of cases, I don't know, the wildfires, we leave the districts up pretty much until the very end, just because the resources are there, especially in a wildfire that's covering a big geographical region. It makes much more sense because our resources are closer to where they need to be at that point, rather than consolidating them later down the road. So, and eventually getting on a scaling down, you're going to close the relief operation. Next slide, please. So let's talk about some district demobilization. A plan may include the time at which DRO headquarters has sufficient span of control. That's one of the things that we always have to focus on. Do we have the right numbers to do this? Whatever it is. So in particular, trying to sustain and or maintain the service delivery that remains. And span of control oftentimes is forgotten. We think about again, the needs resources. We have the resources. We got people here that are already doing this. Let's just put more workload on them, kind of thing. And we fail to truly think about the span of control. The span of control meaning we have to put more people out in the field probably to take on additional delivery or whatever it is at that particular service point. So within those additional retrograde operations for demobilizing a district is that sheltering and feeding services are no longer needed. That's a key point because that's really the main crux of what a district does. They may have IA, individual assistance occurring at the district, but that can easily be folded into headquarters, whereas the point of contact sheltering and feeding services may not be as easy to do with from headquarters. Partly because headquarters may be miles and miles away. I know I was on one DR where the headquarters was down in Fresno and the fire was up in Mariposa, which was, a couple hundred miles away. So that would be very difficult to take that kind of service on. And all clients have received a follow-up casework or recovery planning. So that, again, is what the district is going on. But there are times, and that's not set in stone either, because you may be demobilizing a district because the assistance and service delivery you have there is only sheltering and feeding, and casework may not have been begun at that point. Odds are that you're going to probably keep the district open until you can start casework. But again, it depends upon the location, how far it is from headquarters, and what kind of casework team or recovery team you have in place at that time. So all of those pieces are thought about and conversed both within the DRO organization, but as well as with the affected region or regions or affected units, so that they understand what's coming up. That any of those kind of changes, you need to be in lockstep with them as far as understanding what you're trying to deliver. Next slide, please. So scaling down and closing. This begins with an assessment of the progress of the operation. And this one is, you have to really touch this one and feel this one really wholeheartedly. Okay, you have a service delivery plan that says you're going to do X and accomplish X, and this is what we expect to occur. But doing an assessment of the moment at that time, it really has to be a heartfelt one. We really have to be honest with one another and say, have we done all of this, and or do we have to continue doing this for longer than we anticipate? And that's like, it's a little bit of taking out your crystal ball and taking a best guess, a good professional guess at it. A lot of us have been a lot of DRs, so you have a sense of the pulse, sense of how this is going, and if it is downplaying, then that assessment is a little bit easier. But for those that haven't done that very often, et cetera, but it really has to be a touchy-feely kind of assessment that you need to do there. So in looking at those services, what kind of services can we close down and call completed? And those are hard questions because a lot of people, there'll be a lot of discussion there with ADs and their subordinates about, well, we need to continue X because. DES is a fine example. A lot of times that drags out even longer because we find pockets of areas. Even in if a district is doing casework, as an example, the hot shots may be taking longer time to get those accomplished. Robin, do you think of anything that fits in that category that is hard to calculate and what to close down?
Well, I think an interesting point that I was thinking about as you were speaking, Al, is about the change that we're now experiencing with the COVID environment and the fact that many of the services that would normally lead to scaling down or be a hindrance are actually now being taken up by teams at either a national or a regional place. So things like casework, the casework side before, we could expect that you were going to do cot-to-cot surveys and you were going to have teams that were going to go around from person to person. In a COVID environment now, we've got a different environment to address that. We're not most likely going to be going cot-to-cot in the conduct of the surveys, certainly not with the same number of folks with a smaller footprint. So I see that we've got a different set of requirements that need to be addressed before we scale down some of these activities.
Yeah, very well said. Yeah. So, and that final bullet point there on that slide is establish internal milestones from scaling down and closing. And I say internal is something that as the DRO is working internally, not out to our general public, not necessarily out to our clients yet. We're trying to figure out when we can close something. If something is diminishing as far as demand or requirement, can we really decide, okay, today's the 16th, by the 20th, we can close it down. That's that crystal ball discussion, but a lot of people that are out there in the field and the ADs will have a pretty good flavor as to what they anticipate and anticipate in closing that. So, but you got to set the milestones, and that's in planning that say, okay, by this date, it's not set in stone again, but you said by this date we're going to have this closed or this accomplished. And can you move it? Yeah, absolutely. That's why on the IAP we've got the project tracker, and that we put a date on it and manage that date the best that we can. But is that date, again, like I said, set in stone? No, we can move the date. Okay, well, we missed that mark, but because we're continuing our service delivery. But it is part of the scaling down conversation that we need to have. So next slide, please. So assessing the capability and capacity of units, and I can't emphasize this enough, as a job director, as a deputy director, and as an AD of any of the functions and any of the activities, you need to compare the work that remains to be accomplished and the capacity of the local units. That's conversation that you're having with the RDO, the RE, what's happening out in the community, et cetera. What can they take on? And that may be early on in the discussion. Okay, that you got 1,000 cases, and you're having the discussion with the local region that can you take on 1,000? That's a good opening conversation to have with an RDO and say, hey, can your region take on 1,000 cases? And they say, not. And Robin would say to me, not only no, but he'd say, hell no. But then he says, but who and how and all that good stuff, and initiates the conversation. So how are we going to take care of these 1,000 cases? That, again, is part of the planning phase and thinking about how are we going to hand this back to the local affected unit. So understanding the capacity is something that needs to be initiated in the moment that you think that you've gotten past stabilization and you're going to go into retrograde and start moving yourself down into or out into demobilization. Those conversations need to be taking place at that time. It has to be an honest assessment that's going on there between both parties, both the RDO, RE, and the job director. They need to work very closely at that moment to truly be true to their form. So a good job director is going to make the picture perfectly clear as to what's happening at that moment, what's expected, so that the region is not surprised by the size or magnitude or the needs of the resources that need to go on. I mean, San Bruno pipeline explosion, for that we had a 3.5-year plan for long-term recovery. So that it took great conversation as to how we were going to do that and formulating a team that was going to take that on. So keep that in mind when those initial conversations are happening. Next slide, please. This is one of those I'd really like to emphasize. So you're planning for closure. Okay, closure might be a month away. I know I've seen whatever fire it was that went around Christmas time, went past Thanksgiving into Christmas time. That adds to how you're going to close properly, taking care of your staff, the community, and the clients that have been affected by this incident. So you need to involve everyone that's in. I'm not talking about operations function. I'm talking about operations staff are really anyone that's in your DRO. They are part of the operation. Okay, that's why it's called a DRO, Disaster Response Organization. So that you involve all of them in this planning for closure or planning within the demobilization phase. So involving the local units, that's the RE, the RDO, the DPMs, et cetera, understanding that this is what our intent is, here's our plan, and here's what we see that what is coming up in the near future for you. So the administrative lead for the relief operation, if it's a major, it's a level 5 or more, you're going to have an administrative lead assigned from national headquarters. That's your go-to person as a job director. That's who I'm talking to probably 5 to 6, maybe 10 times a day, depending upon what's going on as to getting some information. Is this the right thing to do? They're just a very good shoulder to lean on and seek information, but they are also the one that's going to approve your demobilization plan, which you will need to submit a plan of demobilization. That first bullet point is the most important. You need, much like they had talked about the last 2 nights on the service delivery plan. Service delivery plan should not be created behind closed doors. It needs to be, everyone needs to be involved in it. Everyone needs to have a piece of it, kind of thing. It's the same thing in closing and demobbing, in that everyone should have a piece of this, because they're the ones that have the eyes and ears of what's happening, and what they expect to happen. So again, that piece there, involvement of the operations staff, that's everyone on board. You have some kind of input in this thing. So next slide, please. So planning for closure. This is a jointly engage the unit leadership, as I said in the previous slide, for planning for scaling down and the responsibilities of the local unit. What we do expect, what we anticipate, what are their needs, et cetera. So that again is in the planning discussion after that assessment of understanding their capability and capacity at that moment. A little footnote in there, keep in mind that, yeah, you have a DRO going on, and if it's affected, say, a couple regions, there's other regular businesses going on in that region. They have DAT calls that go on. They have other activities that are being maintained or going on or scheduled. Those have to be talked about in the planning, and how is that going to affect their ability and capacity and capability of taking on what's left of this DR. So it really should be ongoing throughout the DR. As I mentioned, it seems like Red Cross, the moment we open a shelter, we want to close it down. Well, really, that's our goal. It's the same thing here. We need to be thinking about, once we've passed that initiation phase and we start to stabilize, then we're talking about how do we close this thing down? What is it looking like? And yeah, that's early on. The earlier you can do that, you're going to help logistics, you're going to help workforce. Those are your 2 big working dogs, so to speak, in a DR that are going to help ramp up and help ramp down. So involving those is very, 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 very important. So jointly determine the timing and effective dates for scaling down. Now, everyone's got to agree on this thing. It can't be just one DRO director that stands up there and say, okay, the 18th of such and such, we close everything down. No, it's got to be a joint team, big team effort. Robin, you look like you had something to say.
No? Oh, I was just going to say, you're going to have plenty of helpers figuring out those events, those timelines also, depending on the size. If you've got a little tiny job that's all within the scope of what a region could do, not such a big deal. But as you go up to larger events that have more complex decision points and timelines, you're going to have plenty of other folks that are going to help you make those decisions. So I'll give an example, the campfire. So I had plenty of people that provided me with great guidance. And it often came down to a couple of key decision makers. It came down to talking to Denise as the DDE about timeline. It ended up with personal conversations with Brad about the relative nature of the Red Cross at certain times of year. So Al already mentioned, you go into Thanksgiving and Christmas times and New Year's times. You're considering such things as the availability of local jurisdictions to actually take the ball from you. So, and when you're in some large scale events where the capacity of the emergency management community is strained either by the scale of the event or the duration or the impact on them as a personal basis, you're going to have folks at the divisional and the national level who are going to provide you with some key guidance to figure out how that timeline really should go. And you know, they've got great visibility of things like how tired the workforce is. Campfire happened. Al, where were we like 3 days before the campfire happened? We were in Florida.
Florida, yeah, that's right. Yeah.
And that was after a long series of other hurricanes, and we'd been in Hawaii and other locations along those lines. The good news is that planning and that timeline as part of the service delivery planning process often comes down to some very pointed discussions with key resource providers and decision makers at both the national and the division level that are going to help you figure out what the right times for those are going to be. And by the way, you get to a holiday, it's just going to be longer than you think it's going to be. You have to consider the availability of housing stock. You have to consider people leaving for a variety of reasons. You have to think of the availability of the disaster staff itself, because people want to go home and see their kids and their family, and it's a challenging point of the closure process.
Yeah, exactly. Okay, so next slide, please. So planning. Okay, so the formal scaling down and closing has to be, the plan has to be submitted and approved to the administrative lead. If it's a large or major event, then it's going to national. You know, if it's divisional led, then it's going to Denise. But Denise, you know, for my experience and I'm usually talking to Denise on a daily basis during a DR, if not more than once a day. But she's part of that planning process of scaling down and trying to close. So there's no surprises there. I mean, we're having this conversation pretty much about what's appropriate as far as maintaining what we've got. Do we maintain the feeding and the sheltering and blah, 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 blah. So the director collaborates with the administrative lead for the relief operation to transfer that administrative responsibility and financial authority. So we work together with that. Who's going to take this thing, those two roles on? Could be the same person. It could be going, depending upon the size and the scale and the scope of this disaster and how long it's gone on and the cost, right? Who's going to have the responsibility, the administrative responsibility and the financial authority for this. So that discussion takes place, and a lot of times it goes back to division. And if it's really one of the bigger ones, like a Superstorm Sandy or one of those kind of things, it's going to be national headquarters. It's going to take that role on once the DRO is officially shut down. So next slide. So planning for closure, some considerations. So who will retain the financial commitments? Who's going to pay the bills? And this is where it's a big push and shove. Does it come out of the regional budget in the future to come? And I see Robin over there already scratching his neck and twitching. Or does it go back to national? And again, size, scale, scope, all that stuff comes into play. What's the cost of this DR? Is it millions? Is it a couple 100,000? That sort of stuff. And again, this is not something that's a surprise, because all along you've got the budget, you're living within the budget, or you busted the budget and you've had lots of conversations about rewriting a budget, et cetera, and made adjustments accordingly, both with the IAP as well as the budget. So it's nothing surprising there. And how will further IA be provided? Individual assistance. Is the region going to take this on? And like Robin had mentioned, you know, during COVID here, and even some of our bigger events that have occurred that accessibility is really nil or very challenging, then we switch to virtual casework. And that has worked pretty well in some of them. And I think we've gotten a lot better at doing that. One of the challenges for me as a director or as a manager, is directing a team of caseworkers remotely. How do you keep them motivated? How do you keep them guided, et cetera? That's a big challenge. You know, when you look at numbers of someone who's a caseworker and you've given them 12 clients to call, and they call 2 of them in a 10-hour, 2-hour span, are they doing their job? I mean, so the numbers can't tell you that. So you need to find out. I mean, they're working at home. You know, the baby got sick, the dog ran away, something happened that took them away from doing the job, or the 2 clients they contacted were very challenging, very difficult, so that it was encumbering. So there's a conversation that needs to take place there as to who's going to take on that, carrying on the IA. Again, that folds into the conversation about long-term recovery, if that's appropriate for this DR. And some as we've seen, you have a multi-family fire that is a DR, but the casework is started by the region and is maintained by the region, so that's moot as far as a conversation. So what other financial commitments are there that need to be considered? Rent. Are we carrying on rent for a long-term housing or a long-term recovery location? Other rentable items that we may have, those financial commitments, and understanding what IA may be costing or what expenditure we expect for IA. Surprises. Wow, that's, I think, the hardest part about closing a DR. I started making a list of things where I've had a surprise, and I was going to share some of those. One of them was utility bills that we get hit by because we used a church for an evacuation center or an overnight stay or something like that, and suddenly we get a bill for $10,000 for a utility bill for the lighting that was for the entire month, that sort of thing. And so those in closure, you got to be very aware of that, and that's where I rely heavily on logistics for any of those surprises that may come from facilities that they've set up or are closing down or scheduled to close down. Do we have any things there with facilities? And we're looking at damages that and repairs that need to be made. Those sort of things. Gym floors. I've covered 2 of them at the term of about $42,000 a pop. So it gets very costly in that surprise mechanism. Other things, let's see, the shelter floor, IRV repairs, fine example. And I think, again, that was at your barn there, Robin, when you had all the IRVs over at the SAC Fairgrounds. When IRVs were limping in from Florida, driving across the country, and they were tantamount to being useless to us when they got there because they were in such bad shape because of breaking down, et cetera. There are costs and repairs that are surprises. Now you're going to have those conversations. Who's paying for this? Is this it's a national IRV, obviously, but is it the region, or is it the direct expense to the DR? So those are tough conversations you're having with the administrative person. And if it's a major event, then you're talking to Brad shoulder to shoulder with those about, nope, I'm not going to foot the bill on that one because I got an IRV that I could not use. Well, actually, it was like 10 IRVs that we could not use that sat in the parking lot for a month, and now we have to repair them so they can go home. So those are tough conversations to have. I know one incident that I can share that we had a janitorial service from a school that would come in and not necessarily clean the shelters, but would clean the outlying areas, empty the cans and all that good stuff. And they were, unbeknownst to us at the time, they were doing this after hours from their normal job. So they billed us for overtime. So that was a conversation that we were caught unawares until after the fact. So we're having conversations about that. Who's going to pay for that? Robin, you got any?
Question now.
Okay.
We have a question. Is there a standardized format for scaling down and closure plan?
No.
Transition plan.
Well, yeah, there is a form out there that I've seen as far as transition, and it's antiquated. Really, all it is by function in what your plan is in verbiage and maybe some dates and in numbers. But no, it's like a fancy spreadsheet at the most. But I have not seen anything that's formal. Anyone? Eddie, you got an answer to that?
we use spreadsheets all the time, so I find that most of the larger operations, and I know Kirsten uses them, we do a transition plan. By doing the functions, we don't miss some of those things you were talking about because we raise those questions ahead of time.
Right, right. But I don't think there's a formal form or a formal report per se or plan that you put out. It can be just a Word document, but like Eddie says, I live and die on spreadsheets, so that a spreadsheet would really be the logical way to go, and it works for me. Other questions?
Al, yeah, Al, I would say that as you go for longer term DRs also, as you go into things that are, camp and Cade Fire and the longer term responses, that one of the challenges that you face is you have different staff that come in and leave and come into the DR over time. And things that you were tracking initially in the DR sometimes get lost in the fog of time. So from a transitional plan standpoint, as the job director or as the RDO for different areas, you often need to create your own spreadsheet of important things. For me in the campfire, one of those spreadsheets was, where the hell did we open shelters? Did we have an agreement with them? So it's not always a formalized thing, but you start getting a feel for what's important for you to track that is not in the standardized package.
Yeah, that's well said. And as you do DRs as an AD or as a deputy director or a director, you get comfortable with certain tools, that work for you. I extract a lot of stuff out of RC View that I'll put on my own sheet that gives me an understandable. You got to remember, I'm Italian, so I'm slow on the uptake, but once I get it. So but I have to put it in my own format so that I get a clearer picture. So, anything else on there, Eddie?
Al, I had to
No.
reboot the presentation. Give me a second to get back up to the slide.
Okay.
But I've seen Robin's closing format. He if it gets on his whiteboard, that's an action.
I forget which DR it was. I think it was Camp or one of those that we were able to write directly on the walls. Remember that?
Yep.
That was great. The walls were painted with some kind of special paint where the wall was an entire whiteboard. So we made sure that we filled the whole thing up. But of course, Denise came on and she wanted lines, so she taped the wall. So we had little boxes and cells. I remember that. So whatever works, whatever works. So anything else on there, Eddie, we need to talk about?
Talked about Dave said there are people that are good at closing, just like opening. That's
very true. Very, very true. And is that why they don't let me open? Oh, anyway. Okay. Next slide, please. So reducing and eliminating services, and then a couple of things to keep in mind while we're trying to do this. We're having these conversations about, we have numbers, okay, data-driven decisions again, but such as sheltering. We're looking at the shelter counts, we're looking at the feeding counts, those sort of things. Have they plateaued, and are they diminishing? We need to. That's one of the pieces that we're looking at. But at all times, we need to think about the span of control. We have to maintain the span of control. And oftentimes, I'm guilty of it too. I don't think in those terms. I think about the service delivery and not the span of control and how we can maintain that so that we have good guidance and good support for our team out in the field. So this is the big one. And this is assess the impact of diminished operations. And it's called risk. It's a risk assessment, okay? And you need to fully understand, if you diminish something, what's going to be the response? I mean, that's putting it very simply. And maintaining your table of organization. It's ever changing. You got staff coming and going, particularly the DRs that go for long term, the ones that go into second and third months. Your staff is flipped over at least 2 or 3 times so that understanding what the managed service is going to look like, what's the capability of your organization at that time. Next slide, please. So this one here is the human resources and I said human resources really is workforce today. Workforce and the director must establish a uniform system for releasing staff as soon as possible. And I say uniform because we start just throwing numbers up on the wall. It's like testing the spaghetti if it's cooked or not. Is that how do we know we have enough and have the right people in place? And that's a big guess. Okay, but that's where job director and their lead and his leads need to understand that and understand. Okay, we start releasing people. Do we pick and choose who we're releasing? In some ways, we do. Okay, but we also look at duration. How long has somebody been on the job? And what's their health? What's their attitude? All those sort of things are brought into the picture. But the release piece has to be done right, and that's where and with much chagrin, I think in terms of that's where logs when they did staffing did a very, very good job because they understood and had a good picture of the capability and capacity of the people out in the field. But that's a heavy workload that was on logs, and now we have a workforce group that can do that. And I have not been on a major DR where we've had the workforce group. It's always been logs. So the whole point here is understanding the capability, capacity, experience level that fit the need at that time when you're reducing your staff. So it says right in there, retain the staff that have the needed skills and experience and availability. So any questions or concerns on that? Basically, right people for the right job. Next slide. So closing, some things we need to think about. I love the porta potties. Thank you. So we need to think about the material resources that we have on hand that, you know, you may be planning and closing stuff down, and yet you still have things that are inbound that haven't arrived yet. And what are you going to do with those things? It becomes a question of storage. As Robin said, there's a cost with storage. There is both manpower and space, equipment to move the stuff around, etc., and of course trucks to move it all. So you need to be thinking about what it all takes to return this, to end the rented contract, etc. So you can see up on the slide here, I've got listed equipment. That's office equipment we may have rented, the tables and chairs and copiers. I don't know which fire it was. I think it was one of you and I, Robin, worked on where we had, it was a big claim that we were returning chairs that we had borrowed from some entity, and all of a sudden they were claiming that 50 chairs were missing and the cost of $8,000. I mean, these were plastic chairs. I don't know where that was, but of course it turned out that we hadn't even used those chairs, but it took a little bit of sleuthing from both logs as well as the people out in the field to say, well, we never used those chairs, never received them. But so it's things like that when you're thinking about closing, you're truly being closing it out properly. The miscellaneous supplies. I know that unfortunately, most of the places I've seen close, what they end, the poor region or the poor local office gets dumped. I mean, literally dumped with all this office supply. It's stuff that's, 9,000 pens and pads, and it's a miscellaneous hodgepodge of stuff. But it's not the right thing to do, but what are the options? What do you do with all that stuff? But the miscellaneous supplies really need some good focus as to do that correctly, so that you really don't burden the local region or the local Red Cross office. All the borrowed and rented resources, you need to be closing those things out. And again, that burden rests on logistics to be making sure that those contracts, if there are contracts, rental agreements, whatever, are closed out and appropriately paid for and recorded. So this one here is all known bills are copied, paid, or approved for payment. Before we were making paper copies, all those were going in the job book, which, you know, in some of these larger events, you got about, I don't know, 700, 800, 6409s and all the paperwork assigned to that. So it was reams and reams and reams of paper. So I think, and Eddie, I need you to jump in here. I think now we record that on a flash drive or on something else, right?
And the SPT helps out a lot too.
Yeah, yeah.
One other caveat though, back to resources, is the other entity that we need to be cognizant of when we start the closure is that sometimes it's not our timeline. We have FEMA and some other government partners. They will close down faster than we will, and they want their stuff back. So we need to be careful sometimes that we have backups when they say they want their gear back and we've been using it.
Yeah, exactly. Point well taken. And that is part of that planning process. When we're thinking about closing down stuff, hopefully we have a good, strong relationship, both in external relations, our external relations group, but even as the directorships have relationships with the leads of like FEMA or any of the local governments, that their intention is to close something down, that we're not blindsided by that, so that we have some kind of lead to tell Eddie you have 2 minutes to go pick something up, right?
Yeah, but the best one was when they wanted the bariatric cots back, and well, what are we supposed to do with the clients?
Yeah.
And then the other one is the bills. Sometimes we thought they were paying for it, and then we end up paying for it.
Yeah, yeah, exactly. Next slide, please. Oh, it's looking good. So now that we've put a plan in, et cetera, okay, we get an approval on the plan from the administrative lead, whether it's national or if it's a division, then it's Denise has approved the plan and this is what we're going to do. So now we're going to notify everyone the best way that we can. It's not just an all hands meeting. It's you put it out in writing, you put it out there in the best way that you can, and inform, include the information of how and where the clients can continue receiving assistance. Just because we're closing the DR, that doesn't mean Red Cross is gone and you can't get any more assistance from Red Cross. So it's whether it's a long-term recovery site or it's to the chapter or it's the local faith-based group that may be assisting, et cetera. But some kind of part of that plan is where the client's going to continue getting service or assistance from Red Cross. And as Eddie was just talking about, and we're in conversation with those agencies that have assisted us, partnered up with us about we're moving on here. Are you in agreement, et cetera? And then the announcement that this is the stone cold date that this is going to happen, or dates. It may not be just one date; it may be several dates that are occurring. So, and utilize the appropriate staff, the staff meetings, the all hands, like when I work for Robin gets us all together at 7 in the morning before the day starts so that we can have a behind closed doors conversation. That's when we're talking about the plan has been approved and this is what we're moving forward on. There's no changes, any questions, let's do this kind of thing. Director's letters, I have not found, I've done a few of these, but I have not found them very effectual to our staff because most people don't read them. We have gone great distance, I think, in getting people to truly look at the IAP that are out in the field. And I think we've done a much better job in making sure that IAP is out to everyone. So any other communications that we can utilize through the EOLN, the elected officials network, making sure that they're aware that this is what our plan is, and quite honestly, I know that if we're anticipating of closing down a DR, the EOLN is in that conversation both with the elected official as well as sitting in the room with us in the saying, does this fit? Is this appropriate? Is that what's expected from the community kind of thing? No. Robin, you got something there?
Nope, I just was sitting up straight.
Okay.
Sorry.
So, yeah, please. Next slide. There we are. The recognition, okay, and a lot of times this is foregone. It is, it's thank you very much and don't let the door hit you on the way out kind of thing. And it's unfortunate. I think that the recognition, the appreciation for all our staff, the community leaders, officially, especially the community leaders, because they're the ones that have been carrying this thing on their shoulders, concerned about their community and how it's going to recover, let alone how it has responded and how it's been cared for up to that date. All the agencies, the organizations that contributed to the success of the operation, those need to have be recognized and appreciated. A big thank you and a big whatever it takes. And a lot of times it's a big gathering. If you can get a big gathering now with COVID, that's difficult to do that. Maybe you do it on Zoom or on Teams. Get everybody on board and say thank you and recognize the work, effort, and the time, money, etc., that all of these organizations and agencies have put in. So that it is well said. So recognize the state government agencies. Well, Cal OES, we're always challenged with Cal OES relationship, but I think we're in good stead with them today and have been for some time just because of the work and effort that we have the right people. Luke Beckman is sort of connected at the hip with Cal OES and has a pretty strong relationship. Same as with Robin's group in Sacramento, right there at the Capitol. They're embedded very well with the California government itself, the state government, let alone Cal OES. So that has helped a lot as to expectations, etc. I'll tell you a war story that happened to me when I was very early in Red Cross. Actually, it was my first job director job. It was the Chico fire, whenever that happened, a long time ago. I was believe it was my first job director, but I was mentoring somebody else. And we had emptied the chapter in Chico and had a job headquarters at Chico State, which were fine, et cetera. But we had one person that we left in the office to answer the phone in case someone, called that. We had an 800 number for the general population to call for information. Then the person they put in that office was a brand new volunteer, had been a volunteer for the Red Cross no more than about 2 or 3 days, something like that. I mean, very dedicated and wanted to do the job right. So Cal OES calls that number and calls the Red Cross office and says, hey, Red Cross, we need 50 cots to be sent to wherever, blah, 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 blah. And the new volunteer, not knowing, said, I need to call you right back, and called somebody over at the headquarters. And that person happened to be brand new also. Okay, you can't set this stuff up this way. And I said, do we have 50 cots that we can send to wherever it was needed to go? And the person said, no, we emptied our warehouse. So now this person turns around, the person in the chapter office calls Cal OES and says, I'm sorry, we don't have any cots. Now, turn the time clock ahead, maybe about 6, 7, maybe 8 years. I'm sitting in the governor's office in a planning meeting about what's going to happen next and all this good stuff. And lo and behold, that story pops up again. Red Cross, at one point, when we needed them the most, didn't have a mere 50 cots that they could get for us. So I share that story with you because now you set the time again, and that story popped up time and time and time again. It took forever to have them erase that from their memories because it was just an error. Of course, we had 50 cots. We had 10 million cots. Okay, but it is things like that that are recognizing our state government agencies and that our relationship is strong, and recognize the support, guidance, things that they offered us that supported us in this successful DR. The national volunteer organizations, the many that help us in feeding, et cetera, you need to recognize them also. So don't be afraid to have external relations or EOLN send out certificates of recognition, the plaques and the letters or whatever the case may be, within budget, of course. But I think those are really, really good. The letters of thank you, I think IKD, in-kind donation, does that for value of goods and things like that, but also offers a very good thank you for the donation. But make sure that's covered by all the folks that need that have participated. Next slide. So, in closure, we start what is called a job book and narrative reports from the operations leadership. This should be sort of a recap of what has happened, and no, there is not a specific form for this or an agenda of list per se, but what has happened, what was your successes, what were your challenges, etc. This is not an opportunity to complain. This is not the time to say this was all screwed up and Red Cross doesn't know what the hell what they're doing or any of that stuff. It's really to talk about the accomplishments, not to fan ourselves, but the accomplishments of the success within this operation. Okay, and it covered, and you want that from all aspects of the operation, from logs to staffing or workforce, all the way out to mental health and health services. You want to know how has it done, et cetera. And I usually ask the ADs to make sure that is formulated somehow prior to their departure or the closure of the DR. Oftentimes, I have not seen a narrative. They leave and then you beg for it or something like that, but then it's after the fact. So I think this is something that we can shore up really, really well that will help down the road if and when, now that we budget monies and dollars for an after action review after a level 5 or greater, so that this can add to the lessons learned, to the things that were successful, and maybe some thought that that may have been brand new, like I go back to the wildfire kits, or when I was in Florida, I worked with Apple and we created comfort kits. We assembled comfort kits, and the assembly and the operation of that was unique, and it was very successful. So those sort of things need to get embedded in a narrative. Next slide, please.
Yeah. So,
Yes.
so the narrative report from the RDO perspective is especially important. And Carol, you're on this call. I'm gonna call you out because I remember at the end of the campfire, and Carol drove up with a box truck full of stuff. And the most important piece of all of this box load of 6409s and other documents was a relatively small binder which contained a narrative of the time when I wasn't on the job, and explained all of those unique situations that a job director and an RDO and a DPM that's responsible for this really needs to know about the things that happened. I can't stress enough how important having that narrative that's out there, because you can always look at the 52, 56, 66. You can look at RC View back for 2 weeks and then it evaporates. But a written narrative is especially important to figuring out what really happened. Mm-hmm. And by the way, Al, we've got 13 minutes.
Very good. I think we're going to make it.
One question is the AAR part of the DMO plan?
No. AAR is planned after it's all said and done. There is, I hope that when they did the service delivery plan training the other night, they talked about there is a certain percentage of the budget that is now set aside for the after action review. And it's usually a level 5 or greater that they do that. And it can be anywhere between 2 and 4%. That's discussionable with national, depending upon the size, again, of the DR. So no, it's not part of DMO.
Can I, this is Carol, I'll quickly give you something from the campfire that happened that we need to remember. In logistics, it's big time important in some respects, but I keep all my Red Cross stuff on, and like we returned Avis cars and I went with them, or trucks. And the guy, it was this little tiny shack thing and he had been giving us everything he had and taking it back, and it was a lot of movement for this little small operation that they had there. And I went in and helped them return this, and he came out, he had tears in his eyes. He says, "Is it really over?" And hugged me. But the thing is they got back to them telling them what a great job it was to work with Red Cross. Cross.
Mm.
So our closing is as important in a customer service and a touchy-feely Red Cross. Are you still here? That's another thing you'll hear at closing. Are you still here? Yes, we are. You know, I don't say no, we're closing tomorrow. I'll say yes, we are. And those are important things to close to, because you want to leave well. And so, and Eddie Gilbert taught me that. A little plug for him.
There you go. He needs all the help he can get. So on this slide here, the job book contains the service delivery plan, any addendums or major changes that were made to that. And within the service delivery plan is also the 2066 is the budget. So all transactions, both financial bearing and any of the things that took place, the promises, we offered this or got that or those sort of things. Copies of all the invoices, the 6409s that are complete, that paid and or due, go into the job book. And any notes, letters, emails pertinent to the closure or the transfer of the financial requirements. Anything that's still pending really wants to be a separate tab in the book. It's also noted in the closing plan, talking about the loose ends, because it is being handed back to the region or at least back to the division, if not to national, to take care of those parts. So next slide, please. Final. So there's a transfer of the administrative responsibility. It's transferred from the director back to the individual designated by the executive heads. That could be, again, it depends upon the size of the DR. If it is division led, then most likely national headquarters will dictate that, or it may be the division lead, the executive, which would be Denise, that would assume the responsibility of the operation. Depends upon the size of the operation. Transfer must be approved by the administrative lead, so that I mentioned that already, and I just duplicated that on this slide. Next slide, please. So last but not least, you transfer the responsibility. The responsibility most often goes back to the region. Again, it's not going to be a surprise because we've sat down in multiple meetings talking about what's left, what needs to be continued, what is next, and what does IA look like? Is it long-term? What kind of financial numbers are we looking at? What is the completion rate? Those sort of things. So now we need to designate someone who's going to take on to make the financial commitments and meet the ongoing financial obligations. And that is done in a formal letter. So that there's no doubt about who's doing what to that. Next slide, please. And finally, this list, you've seen it before, and we just made it look prettier and nicer. Clients first, always, 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 always. We think about the clients, that what are their needs, what are their resources, and the resources we have to fill those needs. Always, always we get to yes. Whatever that yes is, may not be the yes that they're looking for, but we have another yes that will fill that need. And have a good hello. That's usually when I'm sent to go close the event, because we've already had the hello, but have an even greater goodbye. As I said earlier, for me, I will always focus on leaving an area that has been affected by a major disaster in a better condition and relationships than when we arrived. And that's important. That just sets us up for the next one, both. And as what Carol just shared, in that it's good to have someone say it's been good to work with Red Cross. Thank you for doing what you guys do. That sort of stuff. Not that we need the kudos or the congratulations, but it tells us that we're on the right track in what we're doing. We've made a good goodbye there. And lastly, and mostly, and now with COVID, we always have to keep the health and safety, and an overall positive attitude must be in the forefront. It's got to be. It is somewhat a scary period of time right now, but I think we have good documentation. We have good training mechanisms in place for us to continue to be able to fulfill and succeed at fulfilling our mission. So that if we keep that health and safety in mind for our fellow Red Crossers, for our clients, and the community at large, I think we'll do very, very well. Next slide. And that's what I've got. Questions, comments? I like what Sherry Curtis put in this chat there. It says per ConOps, clients and volunteers first. Amen. I see a hand up somewhere.
So, hey, Al, it's Chris. While we're looking for those questions, I want to take a minute and just address a couple things. So, first of all, thanks so much to you and Robin for pulling this together, and Eddie and Chris for helping with Pat and all of that. But really great job, I think, and just really appreciate your time. You mentioned one thing really early in the presentation about our relationships with partners, and I think it's just always important when we're standing these up to remember we may be working in an area where the local community has less experience with disasters, frankly, even if they have disaster in their title, they're an emergency manager, whatever it is. But we've been doing this for 130 plus, arguably some odd years, and we bring a lot of knowledge and assets to the table, and sometimes other folks look to us to guide them in how to stand up and how to close an event. And so just as something for folks to factor in. You talked about a lot of the financial things on the surprises piece. I think I just can't say enough the importance about getting agreements in writing, and then transferring those agreements if you transition out and another person comes over and takes over your role or whatever. But get the agreements in writing wherever possible, and then consider the value of transitioning. When we go from one job director to the next, there's got to be a transition period there when we're in between waves or tranches or whatever term you want to call for the multiple churns of staff. But it's just as important for any other position. You want to transition to the next person with as much time so that they understand where everything came from, where the records are, and where they can move it forward for the next couple of weeks or during their tenure in that role. So just make time for that transition. I think Carol hit on this, but I was also going to mention, the Red Cross is never gone. So when we say we're closing or whatever, we're transitioning to the region or whatever it is. My experience on that was during OSO, and I said to a group of funders and partners and county officials, and I said, we've been here since 1917. We're not going anywhere. There's no reason to think that we are, but we may become less visible, and our resources may be reduced, but that doesn't mean we're gone from any community. It's just our region is taking back over. On the recognition piece, I think we all know how important it is. You mentioned letters. I would, pins and T-shirts, and those are important. And I think the key is you can't do it every time. It is expensive. But as we didn't hit on it yesterday during budgeting, we probably should be budgeting an amount for that thing, especially on the big ones, right? Even printing costs of certificates. That's it's all relative, right? It's all relevant. And then my last piece was when you're mentioning you can't make this stuff up when everybody's new, right? You got yourself into a situation where, or we've all told you to take a situation where there was a bunch of new folks around you. Frankly, guys, that can happen to any of us. And I don't know if this is the particular that Al is talking about, but 2018 is a prime example. Then I think Robin and Al talked about it here, where they were 3 days off of Florida for probably Hurricane Michael. Florence had already occurred. I was out on Saipan with Denise and a bunch of you during U2. We had come off of Lane and Olivia. And the organization was exhausted. And so the point of saying that is any of us might be asked to take a role that we feel less familiar with. And frankly, that's why we're doing these confidence builders and spending the time getting as folks as comfortable as possible. And I would close with, all of you have you've signed up as the leaders, whether you realize it or not. There is no other group in our division, at least, that's out there taking trainings like this and spending 4 nights now in 1 week, probably more for others of you, trying to get yourself better situated as a leader in the organization to run some of these responses. And so thank you for that. And it's just very powerful stuff, and we appreciate your time. Thanks, Al.
Thank you, Chris. Thank you for taking on the role in Denise's, when Denise was on PTO. It was seamless, which is really, really nice. So thank you. Thank you for the words. Any questions on the chat, Eddie, we need to address?
A question about their templates or narratives?
Nope, just a good old Word document.
Okay. And then the other one was, are we planning to do any workshops or training on virtual management of an operation?
I don't know, Chris, can you answer that?
Kirsten actually might be better. Are you still on, Kirsten?
Yep.
Do we have any training scheduled for virtual management, that type of thing?
We've been working, oh, we're frozen there. We've been working on supervising the remote workforce. So we'll see how that comes at this point. We're a little bit off from getting that done, but we're working on it right now.
Excellent.
Okay, yeah, that's the best answer we've got right now. I think, as I think we're coming towards the end of the, quote, the institute, but I think we've all seen the power of these. We're having 50 to 70 folks on these things, and every night, which is incredible. And I think what we need to know is what you want to know more of.
Yeah.
I think one of the conversations that came up last night was around analytics on a 5266. And so maybe that's something we need to put together if it's not already in the works. But if there are other things like that, I don't want to flood anybody's email box. But Kirsten, if folks want additional topics covered, is there an email address we can direct them to?
Yes, I'll put it into the chat here. And I would just remind people, we came up with the confidence builders with the idea of helping people navigate, but we did a survey in February, and a lot of the questions that came up helped us generate these ideas.
All right. You can put the last slide up, Barbara. There you go. Any other final comments, concerns, questions, additions? Well, right there, 1 minute past 8:30.
Just one comment from Barbara. I guess she's happy to be part of the PAC now because kind of we know what we're doing, and those of us who've been in PAC say, yeah, we know that.
Not only do we know it, but we'll tell you.
Validation is appreciated.
That's right. Absolutely. All right, anyone. Thank you for spending the early part of your evening with us. I see by the notes that thank you, that it was a good learning experience. So thank you again. Gosh, I miss all of you. This COVID has separated us, but in a lot of ways has connected us even stronger. So thank you for all that you do, whether you're paid for it or you're volunteering for it. Red Cross is an awesome, awesome organization. I always feel privileged and honored to be a part of it, let alone to instruct and to speak to all of you this evening. So thank you so very much. Thank you to my partner, Robin. Robin, by the way, made this, I did the verbiage on the slides, and Robin made it look pretty. It was very, very nice. So thank you all, and everyone have a nice evening. Take care.
Thank you. You take care, Al.
Thank you. You too.
Bye, Bill.
Bye.